Hi. Okay, I think we're trying to do this audio and video at the same time, trying to learn this consistently. So let's take a look at the Haftarah today. It's Tuesday morning of the 9 days. And this Haftarah podcast, like many this week, is being sponsored by our good friends in Teaneck, Mishpacha Sassoni. It's Sassonin family, Dr. Hayes Sassonin family. As he said, in memory of his grandfather, Shlomo ben Yisrael, who didn't go to college or yeshiva, but every single one of his grandchildren did. So that's the American dream. That's the Frum American dream. Let me rephrase. That's the Teaneck American dream. Okay? Which is nothing wrong. Okay. Obviously, this is Shabbos Chazon, which is Parsh Chazon, the first chapter in the book of Isaiah, of course. And just want to zero in on every one of these psukim is like classic and famous, and there's a velt on each one of them, as you know. It's like a happy hunting ground of the Parshanut, isn't it? And I mean, everybody's got what to say on each one of these psukim. And the one that struck me, this time as I was going through it the other day, is Eicha, I think it's number 20, verse 20. Eicha hayelazona kirya nemana malays mishpat ata something gone atam ratzchim. Okay, where Isaiah is saying the city of Jerusalem has turned into a zone, into a prostitute. Pretty heavy language over there. And Malaisi Mishpat used to be famous for Mishpat, and now it's Mratzchim. Now it's full of killers. Well, more than killers, as we'll see over here. As you look at it, and usually the best place when it comes to these hard psukim, in my opinion, as I always say, is the Barbanel. He's not the only one, obviously. That's the best, in my opinion, at least in a thoughtful kind of way. And obviously, what you're seeing over here is a big theme in this Haftarah, chapter 1 in Isaiah, is against formal prayer without any kind of social action consequences. That's why Reform and Conservative always like this. It's very good for a PC. I don't want your lousy carbonas. I'm not interested in you trampling my courtyard. And when you raise your hands to me, I will not listen. So in other words, there's the formal prayer, which once upon a time was basically done in the temple. Like the Rambam says, they didn't start davening until Bayesheni, until a period of the Anshigas Gdola. Me, myself, and I, to tell you the perfect truth, I imagine, the Rambam said it happened time of Ezra Nehemiah. Me, personally, I happen to think, I could of course be wrong, that it started in Babel in the 70 years, because how did the Jews practice anything when they're in Babylonia? In the 7 years of the exile, or more. Surrounded as they are by peak, spitz, pagan culture. Babel, once upon a time, was the city in the world, and it's full of idols and all the rest of it. How did you stay Jewish? There had to evolve some way of the captives in Babylon, even if they're let free, to have some kind of Judaic practice. You understand what I'm talking about? Think about this. The Beis Mikdash is destroyed by Rishon. The Jews, whoever survives, ends up in Babel. Okay. There was no davening of Beis Rishon in a formal sense. There was no synagogue or anything in a formal sense. So all the formal stuff is in the Mishkan or the temple in the Beis Hamikdash done by the priests. It's a Karbanis system. You know the Chumash like I do. And the Rambam, at least, is of the opinion that davening is like the Quakers always say. You just say, how are you, God? And, I like you, and all the rest of it. And say whatever's on your mind. And you can say it in 1 second. Or 10 hours if you're so inclined. The Ramban, I think, says you don't even have to daven. The Rambam says you have to say something every day. The Ramban says you don't want to do it, go to hell, literally. In other words, if you want to live a life without talking to God, go ahead. It's your loss. The Rambam understands it as I understand it, that, if I am right, that there's a chiyuv, you have to say something every day. But there's no such thing as Shachar, Mincha, Ma'ariv, and Musaf and all the rest of it. That took place at Beis Hamikdash. So I don't know how, nobody knows how, they actually practice the Jewish religion in terms of davening and prayer and that sort of thing, which is such an essential part of our lives today, long ago in the time of Beis Hamikdash. All right, put that aside. But then they end up in Golis. So how do you do it then? There is no Beis Hamikdash, there's no active Kohanim, there's no temple ritual. What is Pesach? What is Shosh Regalim? What is Shabbos? And so forth, right? Judaism cannot survive, I think, simply on not eating treif. You know what I'm saying? So what was it? I think, Libi Umberly, that some kind of synagogue institution, prayer, or something like that had to evolve. You do find Daniel, it says, praying 3 times a day towards Jerusalem. He was an exile in Babel. You could argue that that's a personal thing, and that's 100% possible. He was a pietist, after all, he's a Nabi. Or you can say that he was following standard Jewish practice at that time. But okay, that's just a side discussion. The point is that formal prayer you had, but in the Beis Hamikdash, but the Beis Hamikdash was corrupt. That's what he said. Rachatzu Izaku, in this Haftarah, very famously, talks about the corruption of the priesthood, and the Kohanim and all the rest of it. And last week, Haftarah, he also had the Tosei Torah, Rosh Hashivas were no good. That's classic biblical social criticism, prophetic social criticism. So prayer, God says, I'm not interested in. Lamali Rosem Chechem Yom Hashem. Chadshechem B'tzonechem B'tzona Nashi Ha'yisrael Torah. It's pain in the neck to see you perform the rituals in the temple without combining it with justice, which means that the courts are fair and they treat everybody equally. And if somebody hurts someone else, they get redress, mishpat as we call it, even if a rich guy does it to a poor guy. And so basically, this pasuk and the whole Haftarah, a major thing was the decline of kosher mishpat, the way it was practiced in the time of the prophet Isaiah. So the richy riches ran the show, and they corrupted the judicial process, and they bribed the judges, and they probably staffed the judiciary with their appointees. And you end up with a situation where the little guy gets screwed all the time, and that's just the way it goes. And you end up with a situation where nobody has a good word to say about Beis Din, which I'm afraid is often the case even nowadays. Not exactly along the same lines, but I don't think I've ever heard, or hardly ever heard, a good word about a Beis Din, which is not the way it's supposed to be. Okay? And he says, Malesi Mishpat. Yerushalayim in the old days, the prophet says, he imagines, was Malesi, was full of Mishpat. Though it was famous for kosher Mishpat. So once upon a time, the Sanhedrin was there, and so if a guy had a case, let's say in the Malchus Yehuda where Yeshaya lived, let's say, for example, in Beersheba or Lachish or Hebron, and he got shafted, you go to Yerushalayim for redress. Lishkas HaKoshes, and all that, whatever it was in the Bayis Rishon period. And you hope that the little schnook out there got justice. But now, Meratzchem. But now it's a different story. Okay? So he used to be famous for kosher mishpat, but no longer. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I got this idea from the Barban. I'm not claiming he says it. It's just what stirred me to think this. Maybe he says it. It's unclear to me. But it's like this. In the kosher societies, the pagan societies, they had a basic social contract, social order, what he called Mishtar Hamadini. And that means, yes, they had pagan rituals and orgies and all kind of stuff that they did, and human sacrifices they did. But aside from that, they maintained the basic level of low tirtzach, low signov, maybe even low sinov, and that sort of thing. Because you need that for social contract. How are you going to survive if everybody attacks each other on the street? Now, in the old days, they did it the old-fashioned way. Melech b'mishpat yamaretz, a king would be real tough. I'm talking about good kings. And the laws would be savage upon the lawbreakers. So, you torture people to death. I'm talking about perpetrators, killers, stuff like that. You roast them and toast them and bake them and shmake them before you kill them. And you chop off limbs. Whatever. You burn people at the stake. You do whatever you need. Boil them. I'm very serious about this. Look it up. And that way, the fear of the law is on the masses. And even the untutored, unlettered peasant, or even the type of guy who engages, as I say, in all the pervert rituals of the paganism, but is afraid to break the law because of the consequences. So, if you're not Jewish, you can combine paganism with a kind of a just social order. Because any kind of a king knows that if you don't have a basic honesty in the courts, society can't operate. I can't do business with you if you can screw me over and not pay, and you'll bribe the judges and I won't get any redress. So what will happen is this time you burn me, but I'm not going to do business with you anymore. What do they say? Burn me once, shame on you. Burn me twice, shame on me. And next thing, I can't do business with you. I can't do business with that one, this one, that one, the other one. Or I cheat you. So just to run a basic economy, you need what they call a level playing field. And there are even terms for this now. I forget what they call justice, stability, something like that. And so it happened. The Jews, however, Yerushalayim became a zona. What does that mean, a zona over here, right? The Jews were not able to maintain any kind of just social order if they're not true to the monotheism and the Torah laws, which are not easy to enforce. You see, the Jews, I think this is what Yeshaya means, this is my understanding, which is all I ever do. The Jews kept up the Torah laws of criminal law while they combined this with paganism. So the result is, like California under Gavin Newsom, under Torah law, it's almost impossible to get a conviction. You know that. You need 2 and Asra and all the other 9 yards. It's almost impossible. So it's a happy hunting ground for the exploiters and the criminals and others because you can't get convicted. And we say, well, midrabanan, we can do. There are no drabanans. That's what I'm saying. Kiryan Amana. A Kiryan Amana means a safe place, an honest place, a faithful place. But that means that your goal is mishpat, is justice. And if the Torah laws don't work out so well, and that happens, then you supply them with rabbanans and things like that, takanas. Do you remember the Ran? Drashas Aran famously says, I talked about it before, when the people asked the prophet Samuel for a king, and he says it's a bad idea and all the rest of it, and the famous question of the Parshanut, it's a mitzvah to have a king, so what was God angry about? And there are different opinions, and one of them is the Drashas Aran, who says that there's something called the Mishpat HaTorah and something called Mishpat HaMelucha, a Mishpat HaMelech. So under Torah law, it's impossible to get a conviction. But that's meant when society is all nicey nice. So hopefully, if everybody's learning in the kollel and they're having a fight over who found the pen, who gets to keep the pen, you're dealing with honest people over here, and you can apply strict choshen mishpat, strict Torah law, hamotzi mechavel arai, and this, that, and the other. But if you're dealing, because you're dealing with two kollel guys, which I assume are very honest, they just wonder what the din is. And the guy who loses is very happy to lose. Perfectly satisfied. But you go out in the real world, people aren't necessarily so nice and so honest. And it could be that there develops a whole criminal element, mafias and things like this, which the Malbim talks about. I'll show you in a second. And they take advantage of the laws. That's exactly what a mafia is. They discover the loopholes in the law, loopholes in enforcement, to be more honest, and they operate there. For example, it's known in America today, if you're going to sell drugs and this and that and the other, most of the time you get away with it. So it's illegal, but you get away with it. So therefore it's open season for various drug gangs and things of that nature. That's why many people say they never should have banned the drugs in the first place. All you did was create a mafia. Same way like in the Prohibition, all you did was create a mafia. It didn't stop people from drinking. So if this is the case, and they're taking advantage of the laws of the Torah, the Drashas Aran suggests, then there's something called a Melech, who applies a different set of laws, the Melech's laws, which Shmuel talks about, where he says he can take whatever he wants from you and all the rest of it. No, the king invokes what we would call today in English, the closest thing I would say would be martial law. In martial law, you shoot to kill. When there's a riot going on, you see somebody rioting, you shoot to kill. If it's necessary to suppress insurrection. There was no trial. There was no due process. And the legalities of the law were not satisfied. That's true, but it was an emergency situation. So Mishpat HaMelech is like an emergency situation. That's an interesting way of looking at it. But what it means is, if you see society's falling apart, you invoke these kinds of emergency measures. And the Drashas Aran suggests that this is in the Torah. This is what part of when the Torah talks about the Melech, Lefi Aran, this is what it means. Okay? Others can disagree and say it's midrabanan, but it doesn't matter. You have to fill it in. But if you have a situation in which the rich are in charge and the corrupt are in charge, then they'll say, oh no, you got to keep the Torah law. You can't convict anybody unless you have two Eidim and Asra, and they have to warn him beforehand, and the guy has to matar atma lemisa. He says, I don't care, this and the other. So you raise the bar of due process so high that you never get any kind of conviction. So the result is that the clever and the powerful are able to exploit the less clever and the less powerful, and you end up with a reign of terror. Okay? So I say it's like California, where they say you can't get arrested for stealing anything under $1,000. So I'll steal $999. What's to stop me? Right? What kind of business can stay that way? Now, what's interesting is, and this is famous, I just saw it from the Barbadel, in the Psikta, and there's more like this in Megillah too. It said, Malesi Mishpat. If you do the Gematrias, Malesi comes out to Tuf Pei Aleph, that's 481. So he says there were four. Listen to this, Tuf Pei Aleph, because the Malesi Mishpat. Yerushalayim used to be Malesi Mishpat, full of Mishpat. Tuf Pei Aleph Batik and Nesiyas High Yerushalayim. There were 481 big shuls, not shtibels, big shuls in Yerushalayim once upon a time. Keminya Malesi, like the Gematria Malesi. B'cholechem men hayi Beit Sefer LeTalmud, Beit Sefer LeMishnah, or Beit Sefer LeMikra. B'kulan Ola Spasionis Keser Echriva. So I say big shuls, according to this, each one of these 481 shuls had its own day school and yeshiva. This is a base mikra, that'd be like you say a day school, and a base, Mishnah, I think, right? And a base Talmud. So, elementary school, high school, and yeshiva. 481 yeshivas. Sounds like it was a big deal. They coexisted with the corruption and the perversion of Choshen Mishpat. That's the problem. You can have a Lakewood, you can have a Bnei Brak, and the learning is going great, but what's going on in the Choshen Mishpat area, when it comes to business and taking advantage of the poor and ripping off and all the rest of it, one has nothing to do with the other. The yeshiva is the yeshiva, and the same guy that, let me put it this way, if they had 481 flourishing yeshivas and schools and this, that, and the other, somebody was paying for it. Where do you get the bucks to run that kind of thing? Plony and Almoni, this guy and that guy, he's rich. Therefore, he's very good. He's supporting Torah. His name is above the building. You know what I mean? It's the crook, base medrash, okay? It's the cheater, high school, and so forth. Because that's how the world works. So again, 481 synagogues flourishing, 481 yeshivas and high schools, and this and that, the other flourishing. And that means they had to have the money. The money was gotten, through ill-gotten gain, as they say, through a lack of mishpat. Therefore, he says, once upon a time it was Malesi Mishpat, V'yata Meratzchem, right? And the idea goes, well, let me put it this way. Meratzchem, the Malbim says, is as follows. Yesh hevdel ben rotzeach b'kal ben meratzeach b'kaved. There's a difference between a rotzeach, right, and a meratzeach. What he calls kal and kaved, nowadays they call it kal and piel. So to use simple language, I'm oversimplifying. Kal is like regular in diktuk, and piel is intensive. Not always, but that's the basic idea. We all learned this in school one time or another, unless you went to a very from yeshiva in which you learned zero diktuk. But if you learn basics, there's kal and there's piel. So, sholeach means I send you, and mishalech means I kick you out of here. Like that. Intensive. Shover is to bang, and mishaber is to smash, right? Who was it? Somebody had my father for teacher. He told me Schmetters or something like that. So there's Rotzeach and then Miratzeach. So what's the difference? Because Yeshaya doesn't say that it was Malesi Mishpat and now it's Rotzchim. That's bad too. Now it's a Atam Miratzchim. So the Malbim, the Malbim is all into this stuff. And he says, Miratzchim heim chabura v'kesha Rotzchim nim shebeneim etzavim and makabim tzivoy. It's a mafia. It's not killers. It's the syndicate, Murder Incorporated. What's the guy's name? Lansky. Meyer Lansky, right? And Bugsy Siegel, those guys. Again, Chabura v'Kesher Rotzchim. It's a whole organized Chabura, and it's a Kesher. It's a combined, group of Rotzchim. Nimsa b'nei mitzavim and makabim tzivoy. And they're bosses and underlings. They're mitzavim and makabim tzivoy. So it's gangs, right? It could be a whole network, like we have in America. You sure as heck have it in Baltimore. Here it's associated, I believe, with drugs, right? and all the shows and the movies and the TV and this and it's all about the drug gangs and things like that. So v'lo nimtzas shimse boded rakal harosh. So Meratzeach is the mafia boss. And so what's Yeshayahu saying? Once upon a time, it was Malesi Mishpat. He had hundreds of yeshivas, all the rest of it. But Merato Meratzkim. And now they're all financed by the mafia. Okay? So naturally, the city's going to be destroyed. Naturally, that's what that means. So what do you see? On the outside versus the inside, the Chitzonis versus the Penimis. The Chitzonis looks great. Any time about Yeshayahu, or maybe he's looking for in the future, what's the problem? 481 shuls, 481 yeshivas and high schools and all the rest of it. And as people say this, and you got to pay salaries, you got to pay bills, you got to get the money from somewhere. And so where do you get the money from? Don't look too closely. Right? Don't look too closely. It's coming from mafia money. Right? These are meratzchim. These are people that go and murder people in order to get their way ahead. There's a boss that gives the orders and the underlings who carry out the orders. It's what does he say? Chabur b'kesher mitzavim makabim tziboy. So you have a whole business like that, and then God says like this: don't daven to me, don't pray to me. I can't stand the base of Mikdash. I don't like your karbanos. I don't like all the rest of it. He says here that they were Badik and Asiyas. Now either that's an anachronism. I think it's an anachronism. That Chazal. Because they weren't Batik and Asiyas, at least according to the Rambam in the time of the prophet Yeshayahu. But maybe we're wrong, maybe they had some kind of thing like that. All we know is the way they're describing it, at least, let me put it this way, at least in Bayis Sheni period. You know what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying? This is a Chazal I read you before about the 481 shuls. And the Chazal say that the Romans destroyed it. So therefore, they're not talking about Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni. The prophet Isaiah is talking about Bayis Rishon. Yeah, but it also applies by Shani. That's what they do. Meaning you see the same themes. And we see the same things today. Maybe not the level of mafia murder, but, corrupt, rich types and all the rest of it. Who gets honored by the school? Who gets honored by the yeshivas? So-and-so and such and such. And then years later finds out the guy's in jail. Now, one way of looking at it is like this. You have to pay the Rebbe's salaries. That's true. And you have Gez Electric. And, the expenses are the expenses. The other thing is, but is it schmutzige Geld, as they used to say? Where's the money coming from, as we understand it? How's that working? So that's tricky, right? That's tricky. What can we say? That's just how it goes. So nothing has changed in certain regards, except that every year we read the Haftorah, and we reminded of the Churban. I'm not sure how much we're reminded of the social, meaning behind it, because basically what the prophet is saying is, if you just have the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law, then you end up with justice perverted by the clever. You understand? And especially the problem in Jewish law, as I understand it, is it's so complicated, the Choshen Mishpat. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, so you're going to end up being by the system. So it's true that now we have frum lawyers in America. Guys who went to law school but know something about halacha. They don't know halacha exactly, but they're able to advise clients if they've had a few brushes with Beis Din, what do not to do, what to look out for. But it's very far from a perfect system. That's all I'm saying. So when I see Shabbos Chazon, Parshas Chazon, there's many things you see, but the idea that Yerushalayim became a zona because they combined the worst of two elements. They combined the sort of blind application of the letter of the law together with paganism in terms of religious rituals. So if you become pagan with religious rituals, you focus on the ritualistic. I don't know enough about the Avodah Zarah at that time to be able to say, I'll tell you what I suspect, but to be able to say that it was the pagan religions were focused on the rituals instead of the kavanah behind the rituals. Now, I might be wrong about that, but I think it seems to be very much focused on performing the rituals correctly. And when you have that kind of mentality, and you just focus on performing the rituals correctly, without the kavanah behind them, without what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter called the fifth Shulchan Aruch, then you end up with a perversion of justice. You perversion altogether. It's not what God wants. So he gave us the rituals, but it's supposed to be informed by what we famously refer to as the Chovos HaLevavos. You see? If you have one without the other, it ain't so great. At least that's what I think anyway. So I don't want to go too long. Again, I want to thank Mishpachas Sasson in Teaneck. Say he's doing honor of his grandfather. And with that, I wish everybody a good week. And with that, we'll close it.